Hello everyone. My name is Teresa Kellett and I am a Senior Project Officer for WorkUP employed by ANRES. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that this forum is being broadcast from unceded Yagara and Turrbal land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Wherever we are joining from today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I also acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. Today, we will hear presentations from 3 experts, followed by panel discussion. We will then open the discussion for questions from the audience. Questions and comments can be submitted via the Q&A function at any time. We encourage you to submit your questions during the presentations. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the WorkUP website as soon as possible. You can subscribe to the WorkUP e-newsletter to be notified when this is available. There is a QR code on your screen now that you can use to navigate to the WorkUP website. Speaking about gendered violence and systemic forms of discrimination can be confronting and distressing. It is important to take care of yourself while watching this webinar and after. If you would like to access support, please contact one of the services that are on your screen now. 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732, Men's Referral Service 1300-766-491, Lifeline on 13 11 14, or the First Nations Crisis Support Line 13-YARN. Spark webinars are an opportunity to connect practitioners with current research, promoting knowledge sharing across the sector and creating a space for reflecting, thinking, and talking about practice. Participatory action research methodologies locate power with the people who are impacted by the outcome. Today, we are going to hear from researchers who led and participated in a project designed to collect and elevate community wisdom in support of First Nations children and young people who've experienced violence and had contact with the child protection system. Discussing this innovative project with us today is Dr. Candice Butler, Director of the Queensland and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Protection Peak Centre of Excellence. Candice will be speaking to us today about the project, how it worked, what we learned, and what you can do. Community researcher Carol Miller will share what it was like to be part of the research team and her experiences implementing the framework in practice. Professor Daryl Higgins from Australian Catholic University will be speaking about the role of action research methodologies, the value of these approaches, and what we can learn from them. Welcome, Candice, Carol, and Daryl. Candice, you started this project way back in 2021, and it was a long journey for you and the team. Can you tell us about it?
Thank you, and thank you, Teresa, for the opportunity to be a part of today's webinar. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank both Annie, Carol, and Daryl for joining me on the panel today, as I wouldn't be able to do this without them because, we believe, I strongly believe that this shows genuine partnerships and collaboration. And I must say, I'm appreciative of the term doctor, however, I'm not doctor yet. But yes, it was a lovely, promotion, I suppose. So thank you for that.
Anytime.
No worries. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose lands we walk, talk and do business. We acknowledge and pay respects to the many elders past and present who have tirelessly paved the way, guided us, given us strength to draw on knowledge systems of growing up children and their connections to family, community, country and culture. I must preface my part of the presentation by saying when I refer to we, I refer to us as a collective in terms of not only us as a community researcher team, but also we from my role with QuadSIP. I think the cultural expertise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities must be understood, acknowledged and reflected in policy, legislation, service delivery and practice frameworks to ensure the safety and well-being of children and young people and to strengthen families and communities. As part of this research, we acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander professionals, community members, elders, women and young people who shared their stories, knowledge and wisdom throughout this research. The power of their desire to create change energised us all in our efforts. We acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people who have worked to keep themselves and their siblings safe during episodes of violence, including intervening at times to support their parents. We honour their strength and courage and hope that serious attention is paid to the implementation of our framework so they never walk alone again. All chief investigators from QUATSIP and community researchers from our family wellbeing services across Queensland identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. Non-Indigenous research team members from the Institute of Child Protection Studies and QUATSIP partnered to provide research support and technical expertise. This partnership has demonstrated the true value of reconciliation in our nation and has strengthened our action throughout the project. So our research process, we undertook this in 8 regional and remote communities in Queensland. We are very proud that it was led by First Nation chief investigators in partnership with ACU. I think what really drew us to undertaking this important piece of research was definitely that there was a lack of culturally strong responses and service systems for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people who witness and live with domestic and family violence. And this was our primary motivator for our research. Our research project was designed to undertake an investigation of how services and systems can respond more directly to the needs of children and young people and to mitigate against the risk associated with exposure to domestic and family violence and halt the intergenerational impacts on their futures. It is important that the elevation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems is critical to not only for preserving culture, but also for using the wisdom of culture to heal. The creation of new evidence to design a system for Indigenous families experiencing domestic and family violence to begin to be healed and supported to care for their children safely within their own cultural community will ensure more of our children grow up strong in their identity with healthy and strong cultural, social, emotional, physical and spiritual well-being. The purpose of our research was to gain a greater understanding of how to respond effectively to the needs of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, young people and their families. We focused on understanding the experiences and hearing the voices of First Nations children and young people's experiences through engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community leaders, families and young peoples, themselves attending the family wellbeing site at 8 sites in rural and remote areas across Queensland, with the aim to develop a culturally safe and connected best practice framework. This research project was conducted by and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, with a focus on cultural safety and processes that adhere to cultural values and protocols. The project was led by our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community researchers, with support from non-Indigenous researchers. Discussions were recorded, transcribed and provided back to participants for verification. Daryl will provide a bit more information later about how, our participatory action research method, the cycles, the focus, and the processes for input and refinement. One of the important aspects of our research that I would like to highlight is that we at QUATSIP never did anything in isolation of the community researchers and Daryl and Alex. We ensured that we did debrief sessions, writing labs, and the healing framework, and we celebrated our successes at the end of the research. This research seeks to elevate the voices of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in leading change, including reforming child protection systems and child wellbeing practice responses from the perspective of our communities. Some of our key research findings were experiencing domestic and family violence negatively impacted childhoods, behaviours, and the ability to form healthy relationships as adults. These harms were carried forward into adulthood as these children and young people became parents and moved through systems. Most adults who encountered the child protection system as adults had deep childhood wounds from their experiences of domestic and family violence that had never been healed. They were now either seen as victims or perpetrators by the system, but never as the children who had been harmed. Many women and young people continue to experience child protection responses that use oppressive and controlling techniques that mirrored their experiences of violence. This includes many women, in particular mothers, who experience a replication of abuse in the processes, practices, and interventions that child protection agencies use when responding to domestic and family violence. This causes further fear and trauma, resulting in a compounding of the shame and fear that results from the oppressive experiences of domestic and family violence, and often silences our women, children, and young people, and acts as barriers to them seeking support. This research found that experiencing domestic and family violence has long-term impacts on our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, and that a failure to heal their hurts is carried forward as they become parents. This creates, of course, substantial difficulties, including in their parenting and attachment, and can increase the likelihood of children with child protection and juvenile justice systems. Unfortunately, we did hear that child protection intervention rarely attended to the wounds that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and men received in childhood as a result of their experiences of domestic and family violence. However, I would like to highlight what our research found in terms of how we can achieve change and work effectively with our children and young people who have experienced or come into contact with domestic and family violence. And that is that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people have to be at the heart of all decisions and practices. Responses to domestic and family violence in regional and remote contexts must occur within a culturally strong framework that considers the cultural, spiritual, emotional, and physical needs of children and their families. Breaking the cycle of domestic and family violence in the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people requires education. Education for our children and young people about healthy relationships, and education for our women, men, and communities about the impact that domestic and family violence has on our children and young people. Responses to domestic and family violence in the lives of families living in regional and remote parts of Queensland must acknowledge the significant challenges that have to be overcome to secure women's and children's safety. These challenges include poverty, social deprivation, and limited access to secure housing or food. These challenges are further exacerbated by a service system that has failed over successive generations to provide timely responses to our children and young people. We must move beyond an incident response framework dictated by child protection systems and be resourced to build strengths in our communities to address domestic and family violence in a holistic way. Access to support at the right time is vital for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, young people, and families. Community researchers like Auntie Carol in this research often experience referrals coming in late from child safety service centres, sometimes after up to 2 years after incidents of violence, meaning that the children had been left without any support for multiple years. And often the motivation for our families was waning or no longer there. Healing is central to our change. An understanding of trauma informs us, but holistic approaches will transform us, breaking the cycles of trauma in which our children and young people are caught. We are here today to say that the safety of our children and young people is non-negotiable, including the need for safe people, safe places, and safe languages to talk about their experiences. Our child protection and our wider social service systems will continue to cause harm unless they are healing-oriented. So we need to recognise that the ongoing replication of power and oppression in the lives of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Our systems must embody an approach that empowers and drives change, works from a culturally strong foundation, and shifts power balance. To achieve this, we must have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people leading the design, development, and implementation of these programs. We need to embrace compassion. Child protection and social services must move away from regulatory frameworks as the primary means to respond to domestic and family violence and look to restorative practices that listens to the experiences of our children, young people, and families. We need our systems to be responsive. They must be child and family centred and break down barriers to accessing services, including having genuine working relationships. They must have cultural capacity. Systems must not just have cultural competence, but also an awareness of their place in the dominant culture and how it privileges non-Indigenous thinking over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander responses. And finally, our service systems need to be rights focused. They must recognise that they are duty bearers to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, and that they do hold responsibility under human rights instruments, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child and the Rights of Indigenous People and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, to provide access to quality and social and emotional services. Given children and young people most often experience violence within their families and communities, healing parents is a critical first step to healing our children. Our research has demonstrated the need for a healing-oriented system that is both parent-focused and child-centred. This recognises both the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, as well as those primarily responsible for creating safe and strong environments, who are, of course, their parents, their families, and their communities. Until our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people's voices and their experiences of domestic and family violence are heard loudly and clearly and are continuously sought by their communities, systems, and practitioners, no change will occur to support them. This research has outlined a means to achieve this through our Healing Our Children and Young People, a framework to address the impacts of domestic and family violence. This framework seeks to work across all dimensions of safety, and at the heart of this is the strength of cultural connection and identity. Annie Carroll will discuss the healing framework in more detail, the elements, and how she has been able to implement and promote the framework in her region. I thank you for allowing me the time to share our key research findings and sharing with you all the importance of our social service systems and our child protection systems, genuinely listening to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, their families, and their communities.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you for so excellently setting out the context and the key issues in your talk just now. That really set us up well for the discussion today. So you and your team conducted your research at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. So considering the vulnerable nature of the group that you're working with and talking to, how did that impact the way you did your research?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in terms of the impact of COVID that we all experienced over the last couple of years, I think that's why it was so imperative for this research to have community researchers who are based in community and lived and was able to work alongside our communities to not only do the work that they need to do, but also participate in the research. But I think one of the big things, and I know I won't take too much away from Annie Carroll's piece, but I know that part of it is with COVID, there was, unfortunately, we were unable to get into too many rural and remote communities, which we would have loved to have. But I think, given the impacts of the pandemic, I think we were still able to produce a quality research piece that genuinely highlights, that importance of not only hearing from the voices of our children, young people, and families, but elevating community researchers and elevating the role and the really important role that they play in any future research too.
It was a real strength of the project, having people based locally in communities. Mm-hmm. Carol, the research project would not have been possible
without community researchers like yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and the framework and how it all came about and your role working towards the framework and the end goal?
Firstly, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on today and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also like to acknowledge the elders of my traditional owners' land, the Kalkadoon people, and also like to acknowledge our non-Indigenous allies that work together with us in supporting our families, especially our children. Thank you, Daryl and Teresa. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that 2 other workers from TARS in Townsville were involved in this research with me, Trudy Tronk and also Miss Sonia Bogdanic. We had yarning circle with stakeholders who worked with families. We gathered information from them. This information was all recorded and sent back to QuatSIP, and then it was sent on to ANROS to be decoded. We met with families that we'd been working with, so I felt these families had our trust to tell their story with us, with them knowing that we had an understanding of the issues they were facing and what they went through with domestic violence and what needs to happen for them and for their children to heal from family and domestic violence. We made them aware that they were not to blame for what's happened in their family. We talked about the intergenerational trauma and that how it's been passed down through the generations since colonisation took place, and that healing is a must for our children and our parents to be able to live together and continue living in a happy life without any violence. So we place the children at the centre of our research, which means that we hope that policymakers both need to shift from focusing on the adults and rather focusing on the impacts of the children and young people due to being exposed to domestic and family violence. We wanted to provide a strong understanding of the important processes and responses that need to be funded and supported to ensure our children have the best means to break the cycle of that violence in society. The framework has been designed to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations to decolonise practice and to be enabled to develop strong cultural practice for our children and families to heal. It can also be utilised to support our families and communities in having discussions around how to address domestic and family violence, to make the person using violence aware of the impacts that he's having on the family and support him to attend programs and get help so he understands the impact that he's having, especially on the children. So we ultimately want to change the narrative of our children and families being viewed through a deficit lens, ensure that our collective wisdom enables a new healing narrative to prevail and that recognises that healing is both restorative and preventative and that change is possible for all our families. But we need extra funding so we can train people in these programs to support our families. Healing is central to change, and understanding of trauma informs us, but healing approaches will transform us, breaking the cycle of trauma in which our children and young people are caught. The safety of children and young people is non-negotiable, including the need for safe people, safe places and safe narratives to talk about their experience. Children need to feel safe. They need to know the safe person they can go to, that they can trust, that they can talk to. I know from talking to one of our families, one of the big things to come out of research was that if the person using violence was of a stature in that community, they couldn't do anything about it because of them being so frightful of other family members targeting them from exposing that person to being a perpetrator of domestic and family violence. Another one of the issues was if a woman and her children had to go to a shelter, if some of her children were male and over a certain age, then the mother could not take those children to the shelters, so she was forced to stay in that home where the violence would continue. We have some pillars from the research: supporting safety, strong cultural identity, family and community, strong deadly relationships, strengthening our spirits, and supporting safety. So children and young people's mind, body and spirits at the heart of decisions and practice. They must be trauma-informed, strength-based, voice and choice of the child must be listened to. Trauma-informed, safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment. Trauma-informed practice does not blame our families and children for their efforts to manage their traumatic reaction. Strength-based approaches recognises that our children, family and communities have amazing strengths. So we work on a strength-based approach. We look at the strength of the families and build on the strengths they have. We don't take a deficit approach. We always look at the strengths of that family. Sometimes our children and families find it hard to know that they have strengths. By talking to practitioners like myself, we tell them their strengths. Sometimes life has beaten families down and they struggle to identify their strengths, understand their strengths they have and locate them. The voice and choice. Families and communities should be the ones that leads change in domestic and family violence. Our community organisation should be resourced and supported to provide the safety and supports to assist our children and families to respond to domestic and family violence, using their cultural knowledge and skills to create safe places and spaces to support our people. Our communities are strongly committed to safety for our children and young people. That commitment and knowledge should be the first point of call in responding to domestic and family violence. It is about us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having a voice and choice about the decisions for our children and families. I think safety is the children's being able to feel they are safe in whatever environment they are in, comfortable, protected, being able to be themselves, not feel worried, feel like they can have a voice. We must listen to the voice of the child, listen to their story. That is paramount in our work. We must let children express themselves and know that they can go to a safe place if they are feeling unsafe or scared. The safety of our children is non-negotiable. They need safe approaches, including safe people, safe places and safe language to support them in accessing safety for themselves and for their mother or their siblings. Our children's safety is more than their physical safety, it's also their emotional safety, cultural safety and spiritual safety. Supporting our children to have happy childhoods free from experiencing violence is our goal. When our children's social and emotional wellbeing is strong, they thrive. This includes ensuring our children do not have too much responsibility too soon. So we saw that a lot of our children were taking the place of being responsible for their brothers and sisters while the violence was happening, like protecting those children from the violence. We also, as Indigenous people, know that we have our aunties, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers and elders have a critical role in supporting our children to grow and must be supported to take on this role. For our children and young people to be supported to address safety, we must provide them with love, education, health, a home free of violence, calmness and routine, good role models, food, stability, trust, healthy communication, healthy behaviours, healthy intimacy, and knowing what a healthy relationship is like and what an unhealthy relationship is like. We must start this early. Early prevention is the key. Like when children are in primary school, we should start talking to them about healthy relationships, safety for themselves, who is a safe person for them, where they can go if they don't feel safe. The voice of the child is paramount. I can't express that enough. So at the heart of our work is our children's safety. Focus on healing as a prevention, what healing looks like. We must have people trained in this area so they can be the ones to support our children through the healing processes. Healing our children and young people's experience of violence breaks the cycle of intergenerational trauma. That is how we break that ongoing trauma. It's by education. Educating our parents, educating our children on healthy relationships, what is acceptable and what is not. So focusing on helping our children and young people to understand what safety is, experience safety, which will empower them and their family to take actions to ensure safety. Enable our children to learn what strong and healthy relationships are. Our healing framework centres on children in our families and communities and works to provide families and communities with the tools to be able to ensure they can keep our children safe. This includes, like I said, education in our communities on domestic and family violence, healing our families, like dads learning how to be a dad. Because of that stolen generation, when fathers were taken away, they didn't know what it was like to be brought up with a dad. Most importantly, it provides insight on how to heal our children's spirits and minds, ensuring we have the right processes in place and services available to support our children to heal their hurts. We must apply for more funding in this area to be able to educate and upskill workers to be able to work with children and families to prevent domestic and family violence. So extra funding for responses for domestic and family violence is not equitable in this day and age, so we need more funds to be able to provide the responses needed to heal our families. Child protection staff also need extra training and education staff around support in dealing with traumatised children. They must be informed and healing focused, recognises their own practice can cause more trauma to these children by removing them from their home. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Auntie Carol. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for taking us through the framework in such great detail. It sounds like being part of this project was really important to you. As a practitioner, what would you say to other practitioners if they also had the opportunity to participate in something like this?
I would say let the families tell their story, sit with them, active listening, listen to what they're saying, and make them believe that they're not responsible for the hurt and trauma that they are facing, but also to let them know that they can be healed. It is possible to be healed from the trauma and domestic violence that they have endured.
That's so true.
And referring them out to those specialist servers that can be more support and help to themselves as a parent and to the children, especially, so that trauma doesn't continue with those children.
Yeah. I mean, that's the very foundation of this whole project is listening, isn't it? Listening to,
yes.
to people and community.
And
And that's how the whole framework was built, wasn't it?
yes, it was. But I also know there were some areas that we didn't get to, like out west, up in the Gulf country, which I feel is important that we should hear their stories as well and collect that information from them.
Yeah.
Because each region has different experiences and the issues that they're facing are very different from a Townsville area as well, because they're more remote, they've got less programs, less safety places to go to.
That's right.
Yeah.
Can't just be the same approach in every
No,
every place.
it cannot be.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. I'll pass on to Darren.
Fantastic, thank you. So turning to you now, Daryl, it certainly sounds like the project was a huge success. There was a lot of people involved and a lot of really excellent work that happened. It was built on participatory action research methods. For those who aren't very familiar with how that actually works and what that looks like, can you take us through what they are and why we use them and why they're valuable?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Happy to do that. And thank you, Auntie Carol and Candice, for that overview thus far. But before I get going, I'd like to just add my acknowledgement of the lands that we're on today, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the methods that we used in this study were participatory. And I think the key element that hopefully has come out really strongly already was that it was an Indigenous-led project. So it used a whole range of culturally safe participatory action research methods that were led by those First Nations community members themselves. So those are people wearing two hats, like yourself, Auntie Carol. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of their own community, but who are drawing on some of these qualitative research methods that have been used in a range of different projects internationally that really help elevate the voice of those with lived experience of the issue. And so that cultural connection was absolutely central to the research methods. And it was on the basis of that data then that we used those data sources to create new knowledge around what works for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So this was not a study about just documenting the problems. It was actually a study of trying to understand what the solutions might be, understanding the strengths and understanding what might need to happen. And it really drew on research that went on in two parts. So the first part of the report, these are reports that were funded by the ANROS organisation. The first one was called New Ways for Our Families, and then the second one, You Can't Pour from an Empty Cup, which really drew on the conclusions that led then to the development of the framework that Auntie Carol has just outlined to us. So when we talk about participatory action research, what are the methods that we're referring to here? So firstly, it's methods that consider the benefits and the risks to individuals and communities and applied really the ethical guidelines that are set out by, for example, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, both in the design and in the delivery or the execution, if you like, of those methods. So it's holistic and considers the holistic context in which domestic and family violence occurs. And as we've already mentioned a few times already, colonisation is obviously a really key feature to that, and ongoing systemic oppression. So it's attuned to the racism and the injustice that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individual and families not only have experienced in the past, but continue to experience, particularly from systems that continue to be oppressive. The methods were focused on enhancing the capacity of Aboriginal and community-controlled organisations to undertake their own research. So rather than just relying on international research or research that's been conducted by others outside of their community, to actually be part of generating their own data. And so that was a really important part of the project, but also it had a secondary benefit, I think, and maybe we can come back and ask Auntie Carol about this, about the capacity building benefits, if you like, of this research, actually investing in the skill set of those in community in building their ability to tell their own stories through formal kind of research methods. And really that's where my role came in, is being able to kind of mentor and support that capacity building and that knowledge transfer. And so, as we said, it kind of harnessed the skills of the local community researchers and the knowledge that they have of community structures and dynamics, and that was really central to our process. But it, of course, was flexible, and you've already heard how we were doing this in the middle of COVID. So with a number of restrictions in place, it was really important to be able to be flexible. And it incorporated regular and collective analysis of findings and shared learnings. And that's one of the things that I think I valued most about my involvement, was that sharing and that multiple layers, if you like, of exchange of knowledge in order to come up with where the team landed with the practice framework. And so that really comes out in the overall findings. So talking about participatory action research, here's one example of that, and it's called action research cycles. And the idea of action research is that you plan, you then have some action, which is about the implementation, you then observe, see what's happening, and then you reflect. And so all of our community researchers were trained in those action research cycles. And so that going back into community, talking with families, it might be families who are part of a funded service, you know, receiving a service from one of the ACCOs, and other community members, all were participating in this process of identifying what it is that we might need to reflect on, talking about that, putting it in place, reflecting on that. So those action research cycles occurred around these 5 key stages, if you like. So the first stage was internal. So it was the research team themselves kind of applying the knowledge action cycle to themselves. So we first of all asked the questions that I'm going to be covering off in a moment of ourselves as a team. Then it was the community researchers. So those who are based in community and going to be going out with their own communities, they conducted the research with themselves. Then thirdly, it was about the staff in those community research sites. Then fourthly, the broader network, so those others in the community-controlled organisations and some non-government funded providers as well. And then finally, it was the elders in the community, the women in the community, the young people in the community, not necessarily those who are engaged in a service directly. So across all those kind of 5 action research cycles, there was a wealth of data, and you can see here on the slide, overall, more than 200 individual participants. So the first cycle, we had 13 from the research leads at QuatSip. We then had 9 different community researchers who were engaged, both in group chats amongst themselves, but also some individual chats, remembering that again, with COVID happening, we didn't always have everybody participating at the same time. And then those practitioners working in the family wellbeing services and those within their broader networks, those within the community, in other agencies who they interconnect with and draw on for support. And then, as I said, finally, community members. And so I think that gives a really rich, different set of perspectives, all on the same questions. So what did we ask? What was the focus of those different cycles? So cycles 1 to 4 were really about identifying both the challenges, the problems, if you like, that we're wanting to overcome, but also the solutions that people were aware of in supporting families to minimise the impact of domestic and family violence on children and young people. And then cycle 5 in particular was focused on identifying the solutions and the first-hand experiences of what has been or would be useful for enabling children and young people to heal from the impact of domestic and family violence. So the really kind of practical questions that were asked were things like, what makes a healthy relationship? What are some of the challenges in maintaining a healthy relationship? When relationships become unhealthy, what supports families in seeking help, and what might help prevent or stop families from getting the help that they might need? What are some of the most helpful ways that services who are supporting families can use to maintain healthy and safe relationships? And what can help them heal from violence when it has occurred within their families? What would you want other women or men or other people to know about managing power or control in relationships if they were experiencing this? And what are the other comments that they might have and insights that they have? So this was really about participant-led, about how services can better support families if they're experiencing violence. So there were quite broad-ranging and open questions that really allowed us to come up with the research findings and then translating those research findings into the practice framework. So to do this, we had a series of in-person workshops to collectively analyse the findings, and then the group presenting solutions into the key domains that became what I said we turned into the elements of the practice framework. And so myself and my colleague Alex Carl from the Institute of Child Protection Studies, our role in that was to kind of guide and support and mentor. So sometimes it was about being there, being available to answer a kind of technical question around how does qualitative research, deal with this particular issue. Sometimes it was asking prompting with questions, challenging things in order to try and get the best information out of people. Sometimes it was just trying to boost people's confidence, because if this was the first time they'd ever been engaged in a research process, sometimes people think that this is quite far removed from anything that they've done before. And yet my approach is always to see that this is something that's inherent in all of us, that we in fact are always asking questions, trying to make sense of the world, thematically grouping things together and then saying, well, what do we now need to do with that? And that's really the essence of the participatory action research cycles that we had. So in some ways it was about giving confidence to say, yes, you're on the right track. That sounds really amazing. That sounds like it's reflective of the voices that you've heard from in your community, from your experience as a practitioner in your own local area. So right throughout, we really maintained what I would call a collective approach to data analysis and interpretation. It certainly was not, me and other white fellas going away and taking data that had been collected by First Nations people and then handing something back. It was absolutely the opposite of that. It was about letting that data sit with the experts and helping and assisting in whatever way we could to allow that to really emerge. And so those processes of interpretation were very much collaborative and done with a sense of collective purpose right across all the members of the team, from QuatSIP, the community researchers, and then ourselves as external supports from the Institute of Child Protection Studies. So that really led to, with a lot of collaboration, to the final peer review publication being released by ANROS, along with the resulting framework that's really been designed, as we say here, to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations to decolonise practice and to be able to develop strong cultural practice for children and their families. So it was a delight to have been part of the process, a real privilege to have been invited in, and I'm proud of the contributions that we've all been able to make collectively to enhancing practice for children and families across the community. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daryl. That was so informative. We've talked a little bit today about how this was an Indigenous-led project by Indigenous researchers in local communities. For yourself, as a non-Indigenous person coming in and being part of the project, what did that mean for you, and what did you learn as part of being in that process?
Look, it's a great question. Thanks, Teresa. Look, it was absolutely a privilege. That's the first thing I would say. So firstly, having the trust of Candice and her team at QUATSIP to be invited in, that was an enormous privilege. But that privilege comes with an enormous burden, if you like, of recognising my role as a non-Indigenous person in trying to support an Indigenous-led solution. So that did involve some kind of cognitive work on my part. And part of that is, it's very easy, particularly I've been in research for 30 years. And so it's very easy to kind of rely on how you've done things in the past, how I've led teams and so forth. And while I love to make sure that my teams are, functioning well and feeling supported and enabled, it's really easy to kind of jump in and say, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. I try not to do that. I have to, remind myself whenever I'm, working with teams not to do that. But this was a time when it was particularly important for me to be able to bite my tongue and to be able to step back and say, this is not my role to lead. This is my role to be in the background and to support and be available. And thankfully, that was actually never a problem. It was, an amazing team to be with. So, all of the QUATSIP team were, open to me as a white fella, but more importantly was able to value and support the contributions that Alex and I were able to make to the team. And I think certainly when we had, our lovely roundtables and all the community researchers were there in person, and that was fabulous to actually be in the room together. I felt a real genuine sense that people were grateful for the kind of inquisitive questions that I would be able to throw in as an outsider that didn't presume what the answer was. So that's a rather long answer to saying, as a white fella, it was both challenging but incredibly rewarding. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity that this project provided to be able to, support some amazing work.
Do you think you'll take some of those learnings and approaches into future projects that you do, whether they be Indigenous focused or non-Indigenous focused?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that this is probably the most direct example of a project that was really community researcher led. So the learnings that I took from being involved with a project that was actually about building that capacity, not of researchers located in a university or a research institute, but researchers who are living, this stuff every day, living in community, working with families. They have their professional practice expertise to actually be able to build their skill and their confidence in themselves. The skills were largely there. It was actually about drawing that out and saying, you've got this. I think that I'm already starting to see in other projects where that is really being valued, and particularly in other work that I do in my team with projects that are focused on child sexual abuse prevention in particular, that idea of lived experience is really, really important. So I can see a lot of parallels between what we did on this project and what's happening in other projects across the team.
Yeah. Auntie Carol, on that point, Daryl raised earlier in his presentation this concept of the project being a capacity building project and building up the skills of people in community to do this type of work, to become researchers, to develop skills. Was that your experience? Do you feel like you walked away from the project knowing more about research and how to do this sort of work?
Most definitely. I'm very interested in research, so hopefully there'll be more projects become available in this type of work that I would be very interested in doing, and also encouraging other Indigenous people in communities to also be involved in these type of projects.
Fantastic. Well, we will now open up the discussion to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can submit it now using the Q&A function, and we will attempt to get through as many of those as possible. So we've got a couple of questions that have already come in. You can keep sending them in and we'll keep responding to them. So I don't think this is to anyone in particular, so anyone who would like to pick this up can go right ahead. The question is, was there any research done analysing the court's response to a family experience of DFV? I'm curious as to whether the court system is responsive in providing support to First Nation victim survivors of domestic and family violence.
I believe that back when the research was done, the experience that I've had in domestic and family violence, some courts, yes, but some courts, no. I believe that magistrates aren't up to date with domestic and family violence matters. However, in Townsville now, they have a high-risk team that has just started in Townsville, and I believe that this will make much better outcomes for victims of domestic violence, children, but also there is an emphasis on the person using violence to attend programs and also get assistance or whatever help he needs for that understanding of the impacts of domestic and family violence is having on the children and on himself, why he's doing it. He must own those behaviours. So I believe courts now, there are special DV courts as well. So I believe that the issues are being addressed.
Thanks, Carol. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I'm not sure in particular about our research, but I do know from just recent experiences travelling internationally that and drawing on what Annie Carroll just provided in terms of those high-risk teams and responding to different scenarios, such as domestic and family violence, or even our young people who are getting involved in the criminal justice system, those specialist courts in particular do work. And so I think it's an opportunity to really look at ways that, those who are coming into the criminal justice system, ways that we can reclaim that space too, as well as for First Nations processes being embedded throughout. And I think, it's super... and acknowledging too as well that we as a peak body, QUATSIP, have been, over the last couple of years involved in presentations to magistrates about, not only the changes within the Child Protection Act, but also ways in which they can, ask questions and ask, okay, well, what has been occurring? What's been occurring, what's been some of the challenges, but what are some of the ways that as a family you are going to overcome those challenges. So I think the opportunity for specialist courts, but also, opportunities to inform and advise our magistrates in the court system is really important.
Very true. Staying with you, Candice, don't get away that easily. We have a question here about the practical implications of the research. So I thought it might be a good time to talk about the way the practice framework is structured and the reflective questions that are embedded in it and how people can actually use those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we were developing our healing framework alongside our amazing community researchers, we did want to create a tool or resource that was a resource that could be implemented and can actually be place-based. So you won't actually see in the resource any particular ways in which to ask questions. There's just framing of questions. But one of the most important things throughout the framework is, have you listened to children and young people's voices? So and we do provide examples of how you can do that, but it is important to recognize that it is a framework that it's a framework. It's not necessarily Bible, for lack of a better word. It's actually a framework that allows it to be place-based, that allows the practitioner or whoever may be working alongside children and young people who have experienced domestic and family violence, that they can ask the question in a way that best suits them.
Yeah. So the big message there really is the framework itself doesn't give a step-by-step, this is how you do great practice. Each section of the framework has a series of reflective questions, and that's where you start. That's where you start as an organisation, you start as an individual, start as a team, asking those questions and seeing what answers you come up with. Yeah. Because it has to be place-based. And Darryl, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so that idea of the transferability of this framework into different contexts, I think is really important. Actually, Candice, while you were away on your lovely little trip, Garth and I presented to the national group of principal practitioners from child protection agencies across the country, and they were really impressed with the practice framework, and they could see it applying to their contexts right around the country. So I think that's another example of how it isn't kind of constrained in any particular way, and it was lovely that those principal practitioners, some of whom have a particular responsibility for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children within their jurisdiction, but mostly they're dealing right across the spectrum of child protection concerns, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and they could see the value of this. So I think that's a real testament to how appropriate and transferable it is to different contexts, places, etc.
So that was going to be one of my next questions, whether you can... great segue. Whether this is just for Indigenous communities, whether this framework is only to be used in those contexts. Like, what do we think about that? Can we pick it up and use it in other communities? What would be the way that you might go about doing that?
Well, look, can I say, with other research that I've done in the past in the child protection space, often the comment comes back, if we can manage to get it right for our First Nations children, we're probably going to get it right for everybody else. And I think this is just another example of that, because it has been so much driven by families and those close to and working with families about saying what they need, that I think that it's likely to be highly applicable to others. But I'll let the two of you answer it.
Oh yes, I think that it could be used with non-Indigenous families as well, because it's all about listening to the voice of the child, knowing their story and how you can support them to get them through the issues that they're facing.
Yeah. It's about the way of working rather than the steps.
It is. It's about the way of working, and the big focus, the voice of the child.
Mm-hmm. Candice, did you want to add to that at all?
No, I think...
Great. So there's also questions coming in around what contributes to healing. So we've talked a lot about listening. We've talked a lot about place-based responses. Is there anything else that anyone would like to say about the role of healing, or what interventions can support healing, or what ways of working can support healing?
I guess having an understanding of the child's issues, what he's been through, also letting that child know that it's not his fault. I think professional work with psychologists too for some children needs to happen. It all depends on how traumatised they are and what the trauma is that they've been through. Yes, it's about listening to the child, knowing what they've been through. Also with Indigenous children, it's about that child knowing their identity too, knowing their family, knowing that there are families out there that will support and help them knowing that there is somewhere to go that they can talk to and not keep all that trauma to themselves. And to act with compassion towards that child. Yeah.
Candice, does that resonate with you, that idea of being connected to family and culture and country?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, when we even draw upon not only our healing framework, but also, the 5 elements of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle, we need to ensure that, we're looking at prevention, placement, connection, participation, and partnerships, and that we're doing that in a way that recognises the cultural determinants of health too as well. So our connection to land, sea, culture, even our connection to our families, that in itself is a healing process. And even from what we heard from the research too as well, we had mothers saying that, systems don't ever really genuinely listen. And I think that importance of listening, but importance too as well of not being judgmental. When a family comes in crisis and they're outlining everything that may have happened in that crisis situation, then we shouldn't be judging them for that crisis situation. Like, we should be genuinely and actively listening, but also thinking about how can we best support this family or this child or young person.
And looking at the strengths of that family and telling the family the strengths they have, because a lot of our mums and dads don't see the strengths they have. So informing them of the strengths they have is a huge impact on them, knowing that, well, yes, I can do this, or yes, I have done this to protect my children.
It's life-changing, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. And while the various pillars that I think are identified within the framework that kind of contribute and lead to healing, suggest that it's not one thing, that it's a multifaceted concept. And, we talk a lot about, healing from trauma. And so to be able to go back to what does that actually mean on the ground, and what does that look like from an individual child's point of view? And it could be something like a child who's struggling with their own emotions, that they are reactive. It could be in the presence of where the person who's using violence and they struggle with their own emotions, their anger, etc. Or it could be feeling worthless, because if you're growing up in a context where, there is a lot of violence, you're likely to somehow see yourself as to blame for that. So there's some really good evidence-based, kind of strategies that professionals can draw on to help with emotional regulation, and most importantly, to build the kind of skills and capacity of parents to parent safely in non-violent, non-coercive ways. So, I think healing can be, it's an overarching concept that can be unpacked in so many different ways.
It sounds like you're saying not by one person or in one point in time or one way.
Absolutely. Look, I think we have to create healing communities, and that's I think been one of the the real challenges of addressing what I think are the systemic failures of statutory child protection approaches, is that it isn't actually embedded in community and drawing on all of those who are surrounding a child or a young person in order to help not only keep them safe, but to heal from the harm. And interestingly, Alex, Carl and I were part of a team that was looking at the various services or responses that the statutory child protection system here in Queensland had for all children, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And the overwhelming message from that was, yes, when there was domestic violence identified in child protection cases, they were often mum was often referred to an adult DV-oriented clinic, but was there any child-oriented services? No. And so, it's the systemic thing that, we didn't even have these services available in community for anybody, to the degree that it is needed. And ironically, domestic and family violence is the type of harm that most Australians have actually been exposed to. So again, not specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. In our Australian child maltreatment study, it was the type of harm that was most commonly reported. So almost 4 in 10 Australians have experienced that. So, we've got a problem in Australia when we're not actually providing community-led, healing-oriented services to address this most frequent form of harm right across the community. So I'm actually really proud to see what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are doing to be on the forefront of this response.
So true. I mean, it's so often that it's the people that need to adapt to the systems and the structures rather than the systems and structures responding to people. We have a question here about the experience of community members who participated in the project. So, Candice or Carol, you might want to pick this one up. Did you find that people were triggered or distressed by the use of mainstream language, for example, perpetrator, victim, survivor? Did people feel further stigmatised or labelled through their experiences of family violence and or seeking safe and inclusive supports and services? And if so, how was this managed by the research team?
I guess, again, sitting and listening to the family tell their story and once again telling them it wasn't their fault. Most of the families that we interviewed, we had worked with the families previously, so they had a trust in us as workers to tell their story. But also, if I knew that they had to get some type of specialist help, I would refer them to somebody, to a counsellor, anybody that I knew that would support them in that way. But like I said, we'd worked with these families before. We knew the families. They had trust in us. Yeah.
So, Candice, is that resonating with you as well? Having people who are locally based, who had a history in those communities, did that manage the issues that might have come up with, potentially external people coming in and using language that maybe wasn't appropriate?
I 100% agree. And I think part of the research process too, though, of us formulating the questions alongside the community researchers, were asking the community researchers, is this actually how you would ask this question? Like when you're going to sit with a family or sit even with your colleagues, because as Daryl highlighted, the cycle of action research also included yarns with, alongside their team members. And so, it's like it was an opportunity for even all of us to decolonize our thinking and decolonize our questioning. Like, I don't think and I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't think any of us, when we did those action research cycles, we probably never used the word perpetrator, like we probably never used the word like it was more just like yarning in a way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we just naturally yarn, and it's not about victim blaming or even perpetrator blaming, because I was fortunate to go and sit in the action research cycle in Rockhampton, and we had both male and females. And sometimes research would suggest sometimes that it's better to have separate male and females, but I think that came back to the community researchers' ability to make it a safe and supportive and comfortable yarning circle where both the male participants and the female participants were able to share. And if they wanted to, we were more than open to having separate consultations. But it was about acknowledging the safety of those in the room. And I do have to acknowledge both Lisa Hillen and Eva Ruggiero in their preparation. Like, they did a lot of work in terms of our cultural safety protocols, and a lot of work in setting up those really safe spaces and saying, if this happens, what shall we do? So we all felt supported throughout that process. But yeah, I think that's a big takeaway, is that we decolonized our questioning, and we decolonized how we would ask a question. It was never using those sorts of words. I think that's what made it safe too.
Just a reminder of some of the wording that we used. It obviously wasn't literally word for word. It was what inspired the conversations that the community researchers had. but there's no word such as perpetrator or even victim. It's like things such as what makes a healthy relationship, what might stop people using violence, how would you heal if violence has occurred within your family. So I think it was very respectful language that, as you said, was really driven by the input from the community researchers in framing up the questions in the first place.
Yeah, definitely, Daryl.
So a lot of care and thought went into actually creating the design of the project. You didn't dive in there day one and start asking questions. There was a lot of thought that went into the process before you even got to community members.
I might just add, because I think a part of that question too was about if there was ever anyone in the space who was triggered, and of course these conversations are you're going to have people crying, you're going to have people laughing, but that's their way of sharing their story. And I think if you were to, for lack of a better word, shut down that emotion when that comes out, then that is a form too as well of just going back to Western ways of doing work. We as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we laugh, we cry, in terms of when we are in the face of adversity. And so, to keep that as part of it, I think is so important. Like, I think we do need to show the genuine emotion that these conversations trigger for us as First Nations people who have been impacted by colonisation and continue to be impacted by colonisation.
Very well said. There was a phrase in the report and the framework that both you, Candice, and you, Carol, you called out in your presentations that I just wanted to go back to because it really stood out to me as being very evocative and very powerful. And the phrase was, "An understanding of trauma informs us, but healing approaches will transform us." Would you like to speak to what that phrase means to you? What's the significance of phrasing that concept in that way?
I think for myself, when we think of healing approaches, we're looking at a collective, as opposed to just looking at someone as an individual. We're actually looking at them as a collective. Like, we're looking at them in their space, within their family, within their community, and we can't heal without having that connection to our communities, to our families, and to our culture too as well.
So it's really about that phrase, which of course I've now gone away from. An understanding of trauma informs us, but healing approaches will transform us. What does that say to you when you read that, Auntie Carol? What does that meaning? What meaning do you take from that?
I believe healing is central to change, and understanding of trauma informs us. So understanding your feelings and the trauma that you've been through, making you aware that it's not your fault. These behaviours are happened because of this, and this. It's not your fault. Listening to their story again, listening to the voice of the child. And to break the cycle of trauma in children, I believe they must heal. So whatever healing means for that person, or how we get that person to heal, depends on what issues that they've been through in their life. So sitting, talking to them, listening to their story and that type of stuff, and letting them know that it's not your fault.
Yeah, and it's an individual approach.
Yes.
Yeah.
This behaviour you're displaying is because this, and this has happened to you.
Thanks, Auntie Carol. We have another question here for you. So people are wanting to know, essentially what's happening on the ground by the sounds of it. So the question here is, are you finding in your experience of working with families that they're experiencing issues of service fatigue? So are people finding that there are too many services involved, there's too much expectations from services? And if that is your experience, how do we work with this? How do we combat this?
Well, I don't believe that is happening, not from what I see anyway. I believe there are not enough services for some of our families.
Can you remind everyone where you work?
I work for TARS Family Wellbeing Program in Townsville. So TARS is the Townsville Aboriginal Islander Health Service, community controlled. And I believe, especially in the area of domestic and family violence, there is not enough programs to support our families, especially children. There is only one program in Townsville that I know of that support children that have been affected by domestic and family violence. And sometimes there's like an 8-week wait list to get children into those programs. So by doing the research, I'm hoping that government will look at it and realise that they have to put more funding into these programs, especially to support our children.
Thank you so much, Auntie Carol. Daryl, you talked a little bit before about a project that you're working on that is looking at the prevalence of child sexual abuse. So that's with a team of international researchers. It's quite a large project. Do you think that you're going to take anything away from the learnings that you took from this project that will inform that project, or vice versa?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Australian Child Maltreatment Study data collection is finished, and we're focusing on analysing the data. But in fact, we've been engaged by the National Office of Child Safety to do some scoping work around what future waves of an ACMS style study should look at to address what we always recognised were some of the limitations of our study. And one of those is that it was not Indigenous led. And so we have deliberately, although our data are representative of all Australians, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we've not designed it as a study to compare non-Indigenous versus Indigenous. But we recognise that there are lots of research questions that Indigenous communities might want to ask about that question. So we're engaging at the moment, led by Ben Matthews from QUT, with some Indigenous researchers who are driving that scoping work to say, what would future waves of ACMS need to look like? And absolutely that kind of community-led, right from the point of what's the question that we should be even asking? What's the research question? What's the community need, and how can we design a study that will capture that and answer those questions? Absolutely is fundamental to that. So yeah, it's been very important.
And can you talk a little bit more about why it's important not to use comparative questions, or why it's important not to frame a research project in a way that compares Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in that way?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying that you would never do that, but I think it's if the community says this is what we need to have comparative data that says this group versus that group, then I think that's fine. But for me as a white fella to be coming in and I'm going to be saying, that this is the important issue and drawing those comparison, I think that's ethically problematic. And certainly we'd taken advice from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers and key leaders that was not the way to go with the ACMS. And so we've deliberately made that choice. But there are other projects where, of course, it is really important, so many people who are doing research in spaces like Indigenous incarceration, led by Indigenous people who are wanting to highlight the disparities in, probably a whole lot of things like racism, like ongoing trauma from family violence that might be contributing to representation of Indigenous young people in youth justice sectors. So I wouldn't see it as a blanket rule, but what I would see it as, the most important thing is to be able to turn to community, to work with community and have their voices be elevated in terms of what are the questions that they need answering. And I think this project is a great example of the question was, how do we create healing? That was the need that community said. And so all of the methods and processes were around that.
Thanks, Al. Sounds like we're coming back to the same central theme that we've been coming back to throughout the whole webinar, which is, starting with listening and going from there. So, Candice, you are the director of the Centre for Excellence at QUTSIP. What is the Centre for Excellence, and how can people, work with it or become involved?
Yeah. So the Centre of Excellence was launched last year at our WhatsApp conference, and the centre is an opportunity to really amplify the emerging best practice, but also best practice that we know our community-controlled organisations have been doing for since their inception. And so I think part of our role as a Centre of Excellence is partnering with genuine partners who will work alongside us and not dictate the way research or evaluation should be done. But I think it's also an opportunity to build the confidence and build the knowledge and wisdom of our practitioners working within the sector that research and evaluation isn't something that's super scary. I acknowledge for even myself as a practitioner background that when I first heard about research and evaluation, I was like, I don't really think that fits for me. But having people like Daryl and Alex and to really unpack that, actually especially participatory action research about planning, observing, acting, reflecting, that is always happening. Like, we are always doing it. And who better to lead research and evaluation than the oldest surviving culture in the world of 60,000 plus years of knowing how to, research and evaluate even systems. So, seasons and how that impacted on where we lived and where we grew our food and even those knowing family relationships too as well. That in itself is a big piece of research that even I can sometimes laugh about in terms of well, who's who, like with those connections that we just naturally do. When we meet other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we make those connections. So that's a form of research too as well. So yeah.
So I'm going to assume that if other people wanted to do a similar project, you'd all be very pro, working together on a project like this.
Definitely. And I think Daryl already highlighted, as part of this research, we have found opportunities, for further research and identified those limitations, which includes, working alongside our young men to get their, guidance and advice about what does work best in not only domestic and family violence, but when you come into contact with the criminal justice system, like we've identified numerous opportunities for future research and evaluation as part of this report. So I encourage everyone online, if you haven't already, to read both of the research reports and also look at our extremely deadly healing framework too as well. So thank you.
Fantastic. I also want to note there was a question that came in earlier about whether there would be easy read versions of the framework and the report produced. There isn't actually any plans to do that at the moment, but that's a really good point. I think making easy read versions of this work would make it more accessible to more people. So we're going to take that one on notice and think about what we can do about that one. So we have actually come to the end of our time for today. So I just want to give a big thank you to all of our presenters for their fabulous contributions and for taking the time to sit together and talk us through the amazing project that you did. So I'd like to thank the excellent Candice Butler, Professor Daryl Higgins and community researcher Carol Miller for joining us today, and to the attendees for your participation and for your really thoughtful questions. You can find out more about this project via the ANROS website. So visit anros.org.au and search for Healing Our Children and it'll come up for you. Or you can use the QR code that you can see on your screens now. The recording from today will be made available on the WorkUP website as soon as possible for you to share with your colleagues. If you have any questions or comments about this webinar, you can contact me at teresa.kellett@anros.org.au. Our next Spark webinar is scheduled for October the 12th. This webinar, Enhancing Practice at the Intersection of Disability, Violence and Youth, will present findings from two ANROS research projects focusing on children and young people with disability and their experiences with violence. It will also feature disability rights campaigner Ellie Demachelier. Register now to attend via the WorkUP Queensland website at workupqld.org.au. I'm Teresa Kellett, and on behalf of WorkUP, thank you.